Next, we examine the role television plays in presidential politics. For the next hour and a half or so, we'll take you to a panel discussion focusing on the use of TV by candidates during the 1992 presidential race and looking ahead to the 96 election cycle. This event was sponsored by the Annenberg Washington Communications Program of Northwestern University and the Joan Shorenstein Barone Center of Harvard University. Featured speakers included journalists and academics. This panel discussion was recorded shortly after the election of Bill Clinton as president.
We're very pleased to welcome all of you to our conference today. We're also pleased to welcome C-SPAN, which means that many people throughout the country will also have a chance to participate in learning more about the debates past, present, and future, and political discussion on television. I'm Newton Minow, the director of the Annenberg Washington program. We're very pleased that we're working together again with the Joan Shorenstein Barone Center at Harvard. We've done a number of things cooperatively through the years, and this is another in our series. Marvin and I took on our responsibilities at our respective institutions in the summer of 1987, and we've had a marvelous relationship ever since in trying to throw some light on some of the major issues involving communications. The Annenberg Washington program, and I'm very pleased that Meryl and Marjorie Panet are here from the Annenberg Foundation, is operated by Northwestern University to deal with issues of communications policy. We're here in the nation's capital, and we are a bridge where people from government, from academia, and from industry can come to deal with these issues, and this is one of our more important endeavors today. Late in '86, I spent a semester as a visiting fellow at the Kennedy School at Harvard for the purpose of trying to deal with the future of presidential debates. I had been the co-chairman for the League of Women Voters of the debates in 1976 and 1980, and I was smart enough to get a brilliant young lawyer, Cliff Sloan, to come with me to work together on a plan to institutionalize the debates in the future, because we always were unsure and uncertain whether the candidates and the parties would agree and to participate in debates. That led to an actual practical result, believe it or not, the creation of the Bipartisan Commission in early 1987. The first grant came from the 20th Century Fund. The Bipartisan Commission began at that time and succeeded in organizing debates in 1988 and 1992, which all of us saw. All of us participated in. Debates have become more and more important, and today we're going to learn a little bit more about what actually happened in the past, what might be done to make the debates better in the future, what might be done to make sure that they happen. I see our friend John Anderson here, who is a veteran of the on and off participation in the debates in 1980. We saw the participation this time of a third-party candidate, Ross Perot, in 1992. These are very basic, very important issues. And with the help of Marvin Kalb and Ellen Hume from Harvard, we hope to illuminate them today and to give all of us a chance to do some planning for the future. With that, I'd like to present to you the director of the Joan Shorenstein Barone Center, Marvin Kalb.
Thank you. Thank you very It's a pleasure, really, on my part personally, to do another one of these conferences with Newt Minow and the Annenberg Center. I have the highest regard for Newt, and he probably knows more about this subject than anyone else. The first question that comes up is why now? And it's probably strange that so soon after the 1992 presidential debate and campaign that we should be addressing this subject once again, and I think the answer is as simple as it's complicated, it needs improvement, and we probably need all the time in the world to arrive at an improved process. There will, I am happy to say, be differences among us. It would be an awfully boring conference if there weren't. But please understand that these differences are over ideas and over ways of improving the process of selecting our presidents at a time of highly competitive electronic forces and enormous and swift changes on the technological side. And all of these changes, by the way, having an effect upon the way in which the presidential campaign actually is conducted. Recently at the University of Miami under Dean Ed Pfister and inspired to a large extent by some of the ideas of Larry Grossman, a conference on electronic democracy took place. And one lesson was that we're all moving into a new era of American politics that embrace and affect every aspect of the process itself, including presidential debates. And so our differences as we discuss them, I repeat, are over ideas. I'd like to start with 4 ideas. First, the question of legislation, compelling presidential candidates to take part in televised debates if they receive government money. The compelling of participation may, in the minds of some scholars anyway, raise First Amendment questions, concerns, and the compelling of participation may also raise questions about whether such legislation over a long stretch of time really makes sense considering the swift technological changes that are now taking place. But if such legislation is deemed to be appropriate, the suggestion I'm offering is, can language be found to compel participation only for one time, and that be in 1996, to see how it goes, and then come back with parallel legislation in 97 if it's decided that it went well. The second point concerns the Bipartisan Commission on Presidential Debates, which did a good and effective job in 1992, changing the format, being flexible, adjusting, and conducting the debates when they finally took place in a professional manner. Annette Fouie, who is here, deserves a lot of credit for that. However, I believe that the Commission ought to be restructured to take account of at least the following considerations. We saw in 1992, and we'll be discussing that today, that a bipartisan commission is inadequate when a Ross Perot is running, when there is a strong additional political force in the process. It is not a bi- or tripartisan commission that is needed, but a neutral commission that ought to be composed of representatives of both of the major political parties, network executives, scholarly experts, but open at the same time to representatives of other campaigns if those campaigns are considered to be full-blown presidential efforts. The two parties don't run presidential debates. The campaigns and the candidates do. We know that. Therefore, the two parties should not be gatekeepers, admitting some and excluding others from the process. Third, I want to return briefly to this concept of electronic democracy, and this week has been a splendid example of just that. The techniques of the '92 campaign are now being applied to the governing of the nation and focusing on one major issue, such as the economy. Technology is moving so quickly that these techniques are apt to change radically before we, even as a people, return to the polls in '94 and '96. We should be open to these changes and welcome them and adjust our thinking about so-called debates as we get closer to '96. And this would be one principal function of this revamped commission that I have been recommending. And fourth and finally, I'd like to return to a concept that the Shorenstein-Barone Center advanced in September of 1991, namely the 9 Sundays proposal. That for 9 Sundays between Labor Day and Election Day, the span of the general election campaign, that the networks provide free time to the candidates, but it is time that the networks can sell themselves, but that it is free time to the candidates for a discussion of the major issues facing the electorate. If the huge sum of money needed for television buys is one reason for what many of us consider the debasement and corruption of presidential politics, then this idea would go a long way towards reducing the potential for that kind of corruption. The time would be there. It would be there as a result of free editorial choices on the part of the networks, not as a result of any kind of legislation that may be down the pike and imposed by the Congress. The 9 Sundays could be filled with debates. They could be filled with sequential interviews with all of the major candidates, with discussions, with any kind of creative broadcasting done by the networks themselves, with an elaboration, in other words, of the many techniques that we saw used in '92 and are no doubt apt to change significantly by the time we get to '96. So with those preliminary comments, I would like now to go to our first panel, which focuses on institutionalizing the debates, and ask Cliff Sloan, who will be the moderator, to come up here and handle the panelists. But, okay.
Why don't we have the panelists for this panel also come up and take their seats at this time? Good. Any place is fine. Good morning. I'm Cliff Sloan. Our first panel is on institutionalizing the presidential debates. After presidential debates occur, they always assume an aura of absolute inevitability. In the wake of the presidential debates, one journalist wrote, and I quote, "From now on, it will be impossible for any candidate to avoid this kind of confrontation." The journalist was Walter Lippmann. The year was 1960, and there would, of course, be no more presidential debates for another 16 years until the return of the debates in 1976. Now, it is true, in 1992, we had presidential debates for the 5th consecutive presidential election. It was the second set of debates under the auspices of the Commission on Presidential Debates. And the debates were a resounding success, certainly in terms of public interest and the number of viewers. But once again, they occurred only after the all too familiar debate over debates, as it has come to be known, complete with brinksmanship and threats of no debates. And as many people have pointed out, there are at least 2 major problems with this debate over debates. First, there's the very real threat that there will be no debates and that the public will be deprived of the opportunity to see the candidates discourse at length on the substantive issues. Second, even if debates occur, the problem is that the media coverage of the campaign is completely dominated by coverage of the debate over the debates at a critical time, at the very time when the public is tuning in to the campaign and the candidates. The media coverage is consumed with reports about the positioning and bickering and jousting between the candidates about whether there will be debates at all. Many of us who were involved in recommending the creation of the Commission on Presidential Debates thought that the creation of a bipartisan commission would go a long way toward eliminating this spectacle. The thought was that the bipartisan commission would be able to hammer out the details and logistics of the debates well in advance of the heat of the campaign, as it has done, and that the candidates would commit themselves to the arrangements forged by the bipartisan organization. Now, the Commission, in my view, has done an absolutely magnificent job of organizing and presenting the debates. But we still have this quadrennial September struggle over whether there will be debates at all. And the question is this just a fact of life? Is it something we have to live with? Or can something be done about it? And perhaps in contrast to some of Marvin's suggestions, would it help if the Democratic and Republican parties renewed their commitment to presidential debates and expressed their support for the Commission on Presidential Debates? Would it help if the parties included in their platforms planks requiring of their candidates participation in presidential debates? Would a federal requirement for matching funds of participation in presidential debates be appropriate? We'll ask the panelists on this panel to address these kinds of issues. We'll ask them to address two basic topics: what did happen in 1992, and what can be done to further institutionalize the debates in the future. And we will plan to leave plenty of time for questions from the audience. Let me briefly introduce each of our distinguished panelists before calling on each of them for brief opening remarks. First, we have Frank Fahrenkopf, who is a partner at Hogan and Hartson, co-chair of the Commission on Presidential Debates, former chairman of the Republican National Committee, and in that capacity, with his then counterpart at the DNC and now co-chair Paul Kirk, who will be on the next panel, was very instrumental in creating the Commission on Presidential Debates. Next to him, we're honored to have Congressman Edward Markey, Democrat of Massachusetts, chairman of the Telecommunications and Finance Subcommittee of the Energy and Commerce Committee. Congressman Markey has long been a leader in television and telecommunications issues. Next to Congressman Markey, we're pleased to have Bev Lindsay, who is the debate coordinator for the Clinton-Gore campaign. Before that, she was a top aide in the Clinton campaign, and she also held senior positions in the 1988 and 1984 Democratic presidential campaigns. And finally, we're pleased to have Bobby Birchfield, who is a partner at Covington and Burling. He was the general counsel of the Bush Quayle campaign in 1992 and was very involved in negotiating the debate arrangements on behalf of the Bush campaign. And let me first ask Frank to lead us off.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the Annenberg program for inviting me to be here today and to give some brief remarks. And we're going to try to be as brief as we can in our oral presentations so that we'll leave plenty of time for questions. First of all, I've got to say on behalf of the Commission on Presidential Debates how tremendously pleased we were with the results of 1992 in a number of ways. First of all, as most of you know, the viewership of the presidential debates broke every possible record. Later, I think Ed Fooey will talk about some of those numbers, but it's conceivable that the Richmond debate was the most watched television program in the history of television. More people tuned in and watched these debates than ever did before, and as you'll find out later also in the program, more people said that the debates impacted how they voted. It was a very, very important factor. Now, these debates didn't just happen. They were the results really of about 8 years of hard work by many, many people, many of whom are in this room. Through the '88 experience, through symposiums that were held, the original work of the Strauss-Laird Commission, and Newt Minnow's 20th Century Fund. Now, I mention that because it's very, very important. When the commission was created, while Paul Kirk and I were at that time the chairman of the Democratic and Republican National Committees, and the membership of the commission was composed of an equal number of Republicans and Democrats back then, neither the Republican National Committee nor the Democratic National Committee has controlled, influenced, or financed any of the operations of the CPD from the very beginning. As Newt Minow said just a few moments ago, the initial funding came from the 20th Century Fund, a grant that got us off the ground. And while the agreement that was entered into between Paul Kirk and I was unanimously approved by the Republican National Committee and the Democratic National Committee in 1987. That's all that those committees did. Absolutely no influence whatsoever. And of course in 1992 and everything leading up to the 92 debates, neither Paul or I were active participants in our national committees, nor really active participants in the campaigns of the Democratic and Republican nominees. So I think that's important to keep in mind. Marvin used the phrase a little while ago about, well, he didn't think that the two parties should be gatekeepers to the debate. I would respond to that by agreeing with him and saying very clearly the Republican and Democratic Party have not been gatekeepers, at least with regard to anything that's gone on with the Commission on Presidential Debates. There's another reason why I think that party involvement must be eliminated, and that is legal reasons. There's absolutely no question when the first committee report came out of the Georgetown CSIS Laird Strauss Committee, that the language in that committee report talks about by having a committee or a commission which is composed of leaders of the Republican and Democratic parties, it would be a way to strengthen the two-party system. That was certainly a very important part of the recommendations that came out of that commission following the '84 campaign. The law now makes that type of approach totally unacceptable. A 501c3 entity, which under the Federal Election Commission regulations is the entity that can sponsor presidential debates, cannot be involved in partisan politics, or you lose your 501c3 requirement, and you wouldn't be able then to, in fact, host or produce the debates. So we have been religiously attuned to that in everything that we've done. You'll recall that in following the 1988 debates, we were sued by Lenore Fulani. That case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. Both the League of Women Voters and the Commission are again now the subject of suits. The League for its primary debates during the 1992 cycle, and our suit lies with regard to the debates that were held between Mr. Bush, President Clinton, and Mr. Perot. So I just think that asking the Republican or Democratic National Committee now to endorse it, it's fine. We welcome everyone who would go forth and say we think the Commission on Presidential Debate should be supported, but it certainly would not have any legal implication with regard to any activities. A third, with regard to whether or not you should require the candidates to pledge to participate in a certain number of debates by statute, and if they do not, they don't get federal money. I'm against that particular provision. Ed, I think you did it get introduced, the one, your statute?
We'll do it later on this week, yeah.
This week, I know, and I've looked at Congressman Markey's bill, and he and Senator Graham of Florida, I know in the last Congress also had a bill. And of course, we're going to study the bills that come forward. There are a number of bills in Congress. I'm against it for two reasons, fundamentally. If we want to keep politics out of the negotiations and what goes on in presidential debates, we certainly don't want the Congress of the United States, in fact, creating by statute provisions as to who should debate, who should not debate, what happens if you do, what happens if you don't. The original bill that was in the last Congress actually stated how long the debates were going to be, the subject matter of the debates, and so forth. So I just am vehemently against involving the United States Congress in that activity. But secondly, and I guess more importantly for me, I think that candidates have a constitutional First Amendment right not to debate, should they decide they don't want to. Now, they're going to have to bear the consequences of that. And I think what we saw in the debate about debates in 1992, that George Bush realized that the debate over debates and the maneuvering that went on eventually hurt the president. The chicken costumes showing up at those rallies were disastrous. And I don't think that we should say to anyone, you have to debate. If you don't want to debate, that's fine, but boy, you better be prepared to step up and tell the American people why you're not going to debate, and they'll pass judgment on whether or not your reasons are legitimate or not. I also believe the debates are institutionalized now. I just find it hard to believe that any presidential candidate would have the ability to say, I am just not going to debate, and is going to get away with it without great political harm. I probably went too long, but I wanted to cover those topics, and I'll be happy to amplify on them in question and answer period.
Thank you, Frank. Actually, now I'd like to go to Bobby Birchfield, if I could. Bobby?
Thanks, Cliff. I'm in agreement in many ways with what Frank has just said, but in disagreement on a number of the points that he made. One of our points of agreement is that we both believe, I believe very strongly, that the debates are already institutionalized. The statement that Cliff read at the outset of the presentation from Walter Lippmann from 1960 looks rather odd in hindsight, since debates did not occur in 64, 68, or 72. But remember that Walter Lippmann, despite all of his acumen and wisdom, was speaking about a debate scenario that occurred in only one presidential election year. We have now a track record of 5 consecutive presidential elections. I believe the American people have come to expect and demand debates of the candidates. And as Frank pointed out, unless the candidates have a very compelling reason for refusing to debate, they're going to suffer in the public opinion polls. The Bush campaign found that out. It was always the position of the Bush campaign that we wanted to debate. We were, at all times after the Democratic convention, running behind in the race, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that debates were in our advantage, to our advantage. Nevertheless, we did not like the proposal that had been tendered by the commission, and historically the presidential campaigns had negotiated with each other to set the terms of the debates, and that's what we were after. A statutory requirement for debates, it seems to me, is unnecessary in light of that, and would create a number of different problems. And let me just isolate a few. I've looked at Congressman Markey's legislation, and I know that the intentions are good, but it does raise a number of very difficult problems. It requires candidates to sign a commitment at the outset of their receipt of federal general election funds, the $55 million that federal candidates receive immediately following their party conventions, a commitment that they will engage in debates with all other candidates receiving those funds. That's an open-ended commitment. Unless the federal government is going to set up a commission or statutorily sanction a particular commission to supervise these debates, there will be numerous entities, and we had numerous entities this year that were willing to sponsor debates, who were going to be submitting different proposals. President Bush could have made a very compelling case, I submit, that he was willing to debate, even if the debates had not ultimately happened, and even if the commission proposal had not been accepted, as ultimately it was not accepted. So that's the first problem. Who determines under the legislation what is a reasonable package of presidential debates? Second, the statutory entity, if one is created, would assume the responsibility historically assumed by the candidates for setting the locations, times, formats, input into selection of panelists and moderators, and I believe most presidential candidates would be reluctant to give up that sort of authority. Finally, in terms of enforcement, Congressman Markey's bill delegates to the Federal Election Commission the determination of whether a candidate has fulfilled the responsibility of his pledge and whether the candidate has a good faith reason for not fulfilling it. Those of you who have dealt with the Federal Election Commission know that speed is not one of the things that it holds itself out as known for. Moreover, bear in mind that once the money is in the hands of a federal presidential candidate, it is being spent at a rapid rate. From the Republican convention in August in mid-August through the election in early November, we spent that $55 million. There is simply no way that you can ever get that money back once the candidates have it in their hands. I don't believe that the enforcement provisions are really very effective. Finally, a couple of more esoteric questions. In the event that Congress decides to provide public funding for congressional campaigns, would Congress impose the similar requirement of debates upon its own members as a condition to receiving federal funding? And would Congress impose that same requirement for debates on presidential candidates who receive matching funds during the federal primary period? I think these are very important questions, and a court is going to look at those issues in the context of the First Amendment issue that Frank Fahrenkopf mentioned a few minutes ago. Quickly, let me talk for just a minute about the role of the Commission on Presidential Debates in future debates. As many of you may know, but I believe there was a misperception in the public at large, and we suffered from it. I think the Clinton campaign quite appropriately took advantage of this. The Commission on Presidential Debates was never sanctioned by either the parties or the campaigns to set the terms or the formats of the presidential debates. There was no agreement that the party candidates or that the candidates themselves would adhere to the terms that the Commission came up with. In our attempt to modify those terms, we took, frankly, a terrible beating in the public opinion polls. But the fact is, in each of the elections, 1960 and 76 through 92, in which there have been presidential debates, the candidates have been intimately involved in setting the terms for the presidential debates. I believe that is not unreasonable. I believe this year the package of debates that the candidates ultimately came up with was a more innovative, exciting package than the Commission table. We had a town hall debate, which wasn't contemplated by the Commission package. We had 4 different formats in 8 days. That was that was a landmark package of debates. I think we learned as a country a lot from it. I think the voters reacted very favorably to it. And finally, no matter what the package looks like when it's proposed by the Commission, there will always be details that will need to be worked out after the candidates sign on to such a proposal. This year, the Commission's proposal was to have 4 debates that were moderated by a single moderator who would facilitate interaction of the candidates. That would require a great deal of work to formalize into a specific debate format proposal. During the Democratic primaries, the Democrats used single moderators about 20 times, and I could probably point to about 10 different formats that were used with that single moderator. We had 2 different formats in the 4 debates that we used employing a single moderator. The candidates will always have to be involved in working out such details, and I think it's only appropriate to put the candidates at the table from the very outset. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bobby. Now let me ask Bev Lindsay to speak. Bev.
The problem with going last is that almost everything you wanted to say has already been said, so pardon me if it's a bit redundant. I think on the first issue of institutionalization of the debates, Bobby, I think it's important to point out that in '84, the agreement between the 2 parties on debates was 3 pages. And in '88, it was 13 pages. The one we ended up with 36 pages. And I'm not even an attorney, so I wasn't even involved in producing the paper there. So I think that the question of whether to debate was never an issue, and that points to the fact that debates are already institutionalized. The only issues I think that were resolved was when, where, and how. And even once we got through the whether or not President Bush is going to debate, and we got to the table to actually negotiate the agreement, those were still the 3 issues that we discussed and compromised on for hours and hours at end and through 2 long nights. And I think that those 3 important issues are issues that each candidate or each campaign is going to want to be intimately involved in, so that there's very little that an organization or an institution can do beforehand to really set those terms until the candidates do get intimately involved. From our campaign perspective, we, as you all will remember, did accept the Presidential Commission's proposal on debates in July with a letter from Mickey Cantor. And from then, we set about taking care of the logistical needs that need to happen and setting up the issues briefing and the background and the substantive work. So from then on, it was pretty much set, and our schedule was driven by the proposed debate schedule. And as I'm sure Bobby remembers, we did make the first 2 debates. And this chicken kept showing up from somewhere, and that sort of reinforced the fact that there would probably be other debates in the future. And then once we got into the negotiations and did settle some of the issues I discussed before, I think Bobby's right in that I think the proposal or the agreement we came up with was in terms better for our needs than the proposal set up by the commission. Of course, there were some problems there in that the time frame was so compact. I'm not sure that any of us would have ever proposed and would ever propose again doing 4 debates in 8 days or 9 days or however many it was. I think the fact that any of us lived through it was telling on either our stability or stamina or perseverance or obsession, perhaps. But
the fact that we were all already over the edge.
we'd already reached that point. But it was difficult at that point to achieve our goals. If we hadn't had an institution behind us, such as the commission, that had all of the other technological and infrastructure dealt with pretty much ahead of time, I'm not sure we would have been able to pull it off. And interestingly enough, when you talk again about institutionalizing, the one debate format that I think turned out to be the most popular and perhaps had the higher audience was the town hall meeting, which was not in the commission's original proposal and is one that we brought to the table and discussed, and the 2 campaigns sort of worked it out. And I might say that the commission staff was not pleased when we presented it to them. And rightly so. They had major concerns about their ability to pull this off. It was a situation that they had not produced before. They had a major quick turnaround. No one was sure about lights, about the sound, about how it worked. And we were fairly adamant that we wanted that to happen. And to their credit, it was pulled off without a hitch and was a perfect production. So I think, in summation, I would say that I think if in the broader term of institutionalization of debates, it's already done in the public mind and in the public interest. I think there will be debates. I think there's very little way candidates can get away from debating at this point, and I think that that was illustrated this past year. But I would caution strenuously against any sort of further institutionalization of the format. That's always going to be, there are too much personal preferences or too much changing in technology or what one campaign wants or another wants, and there are too many other points of preference that have to be taken into consideration before a final agreement would be reached.
Thank you, Bev. We now turn to Congressman Markey, who genuinely has the burden of going last. He also has the advantage, perhaps, of not having, unlike our prior 3 speakers, not having been in the trenches on the 1992 arrangements, and his involvement in the issue stems from his general involvement in television and telecommunications issues.
Thank you, Cliff, very much. Bev is right. Everything has been said. But as the great Mo Udall used to say, not everyone has said it. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to add my thoughts to the session. I have an interest in the presidential debates, not only because I sponsored last year's bill, but because I am chairman of the House Subcommittee on Telecommunications and Finance, a job that gives me a front row seat at the revolution, the fantastic communications revolution now taking place in the United States and around the world. This revolution is changing the way we work, the way we entertain ourselves, and increasingly the way we conduct elections. And the pace of the change is amazing. 10 years ago, for instance, cellular phones were a rarity. Today, you're not a self-respecting political operative or news reporter if you don't have your own cellular phone on the road. But nowhere is the change more profound than in the world of television. A decade or so ago, the three major networks controlled more than 90% of the television market. Today, the majority of Americans can turn on their TV and get more than 50 channels. Right now in Queens, New York, Time Warner is experimenting with a 200-channel system, and in Orlando, Florida, they are about to begin a 500-channel experiment. Who would have predicted, even in 1988, that Larry King, Phil Donahue, Tabitha Soren of MTV would wield nearly as much influence in presidential politics as Peter Jennings, Dan Rather, and Tom Brokaw? Today, a voter can design his or her own campaign. His or her own recipe might include a little MTV, perhaps a talk show or two, some CNN, and maybe a dash of the network shows. The communications revolution has created a more democratic campaign environment, and as a result of this new environment, voters last year were able to demand and get more direct access to the candidates themselves without the filtering of reporters, pundits, and advertising gurus, candidates who were willing to listen and to answer voter questions directly, real answers from the candidates, not just 30-second commercials or 10-second sound bites. In my opinion, the Clinton and Perot campaigns understood the new rules and the new media better than the Bush campaign understood it. When the network news wrote both of these candidates off, they pursued other avenues. President Clinton shifted to the talk shows. Ross Perot bought his own time, where he successfully treated information-starved voters to a pile of charts and graphs. The presidential debates embody much of the new ethos. They provide voters with an unfiltered view of the candidates, and they force the candidates to answer tough questions directly, with details and without spin masters. But the debates also provide us with an element of the old mass media era that is perhaps worth preserving. They are truly a national event. According to the Debates Commission, 97 million Americans watched last year's final debate, one of the highest rated programs of the year, right up there with the number of people watching Oprah Talks to Michael Jackson. A counterintuitive response, I am sure, from the American viewer than most political observers probably thought was likely. So, like the other big-time sporting events, the Super Bowl, the World Series, and other big television events, the debates give Americans a sense of a shared experience. We watch the debates in our living rooms and compare notes with family and friends. The next day, we assess the candidates and their views at the water cooler and in the cafeteria at work. After a year of political wrangling and infighting, the debates finally give voters the real answers which they need. And they build a sense of enthusiasm and anticipation about the election, drawing people to the polls. The interest in this year's debates undoubtedly helped generate the increased turnout we saw at the polls last year. Many of us here today remember the first televised debate in 1960 and its electrifying effect upon the campaign. John Kennedy's performance not only changed the course of the election, but ultimately the course of American politics and history. Unfortunately, as you know, it has not been smooth sailing since. There were no debates between 1964 and 72. And each year since 1980, the debates have been threatened by campaign posturing. This past year, first, the Bush campaign spent weeks avoiding the debates, only to embrace them at the last minute when they felt the debates were their last best hope to win. Now, Senator Bob Graham of Florida and I have a solution to this quadrennial wrangle. Within the next several days, we will reintroduce our bill that requires campaigns which take public funds to engage in 4 presidential debates and 1 vice presidential debate. Last year, voters shelled out $110 million in general election funds. It seems to me 5 debates is the least the candidates can do in return. Our bill was included in last year's campaign finance reform bill, passed last year by both the House and the Senate, but then vetoed by President Bush. But we got it to the president's desk. With a new president in office who is committed to campaign finance reform, a commitment made clear once again on Wednesday night, I believe we have a real chance to make the debate bill originally filed in 1989 a reality in 1993. And I believe it is in the interest of everyone here today, especially the press and the major political parties, to put an end to the debate squabbling that has characterized the past several campaigns. The voters want these debates, and the reluctance of the major parties to embrace them, I believe, is one of the reasons too many voters have lost faith in the political process. I urge all of you to help Senator Graham and I to once again pass this legislation and to put it on President Clinton's desk before the end of this session, because I think in the end it is best not only for the voters of the United States, but also for the press and the political parties as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Markey. We'd now like to open it up for questions, and if I could just ask each questioner, there will be mics throughout the room to speak into a mic and to identify yourself, please, as you ask the question. Are there any questions? No?
Hi, my name is Nell Mano, and I would like to ask Ms. Lindsay and Mr. Birchfield, what were the 3 a.m. Final things that were the most difficult to resolve?
Who was paying for the coffee?
How we were going to get to Little Rock at 3 a.m. I suppose you mean with the negotiations on the initial agreement. I think the only major concern and source of disagreement between the two campaigns was the schedule.
I agree with that. We came in seeking a delayed start to the debates and a late and a debate as late as possible.
You weren't seeking it; you forced it.
It wasn't quite as late as we had wanted, but the Clinton campaign wanted the debates to start earlier and end earlier, I think. And the parameters of how much flexibility we had on those were the subject of about 36 hours of jousting. But Bev is right. Once we got the schedule nailed down, everything else began to fall into place very quickly. So that was really the principal hang-up. The formats we came to agreement fairly quickly on. The amount of time. The inclusion of Mr. Perot, which we wanted, all of that was worked out very quickly after we got the schedule.
Let me ask one question about how these negotiations work. Was it just between the Bush campaign and the Clinton campaign? Does the commission have a role in the negotiations? Does any representative of the Perot campaign? Who is negotiating?
It was just the two campaigns that were involved in the negotiations, and we submitted the 36-page agreement that Bev referred to the commission with an invitation for them to sponsor the debates as negotiated.
Okay. Yes.
Hi, I'm Andy Schwartzman, Executive Director of Media Access Project. My longstanding concern has been with accommodating credible, non-frivolous third and fourth candidates. And I wonder if the seeming ease with which the pro candidacy was accommodated this season may be illusory. He had a tremendous amount of money and a unique set of political circumstances that compelled inclusion. I'm not sure John Anderson or George Wallace or other candidates would have done as well. I'm wondering if, when you say that it's been institutionalized, if you think that the inclusion of serious third or fourth candidates has also been institutionalized. For example, although I'm probably more supportive of Congressman Markey's legislation than many of the people here in the room, I'm struck by the fact that the club of the legislation, which is the denial of federal funds, would not have been an issue for Ross Perot.
Let me just mention that the whole subject of third parties and other candidates will be the subject of the next panel, but all of these topics are interrelated, and so let me just see if any of our panelists here would like to address that.
Well, you're right. There would not have been the club with Ross Perot because Mr. Perot decided not to pursue federal funding. We, as I'm sure Paul Kirk and the members of the next committee will talk about, next panel will talk about, we worked very, very hard to make sure that we were able to provide means by which third or independent party candidates could be included. And in many ways, the law provides a framework. Whoever would be the sponsor of a debate as to what has to go into the consideration of inclusion or non-inclusion.
Speaking on behalf of both campaigns, I believe we never considered excluding a qualified third-party candidate.
But one reason that we did take it up in the negotiations was that it was unclear to us, at least in the Bush campaign, that Perot would be included upon application of the numerous criteria the commission had set forth for inclusion of third-party candidates. For example, and many of you may be familiar with those criteria, among the criteria were such things as declaration of a third party or independent candidacy before the major party conventions, or alternatively, declaration of an independent candidacy after a major party convention by disaffiliating from the party. And it seemed to us, and there were also requirements that national news figures and commentators give the candidate some chance to win the election, and showing in the polls was also a factor. You may recall that in early October, on October 1, when Mr. Perot announced his re-entry into the race, he was about 5 to 7% in the polls, and I'm not aware of any major national news commentator that was giving him at that point a chance of winning the election, affecting it maybe, but not winning it. So it was far from clear to us that Mr. Perot would be included in the debates if the commission's criteria were applied. That's why we insisted, and the Clinton campaign agreed, that it be included as part of the agreement.
Well, now I hope that there's going to be candor somewhere by the campaigns along the way here, that the reason that they wanted Ross Perot included, both campaigns thought it was to their own advantage. It had nothing to do, in my view, with that suddenly they wanted to make sure that all these issues were aired. They both sat down and felt, hey, Perot's inclusion is going to help us. That's why we want it. And that's why those decisions were made. And I think for anyone to say, gee whiz, if it hadn't been for the tough negotiations and the great job the two campaigns done, look at the wonderful 4 debates that we had. It's absolutely no question that, in a way, they lucked out, or the American people lucked out, because we had an opportunity to really have an experiment in 1992. That experiment gave us a look at 4 debate formats. Bobby's 100% correct. There were 4 separate formats. We really had an opportunity to see what works and doesn't work, where before our recommendation, the Commission's recommendation, was the result of a study and symposium. We never really had an opportunity to see it actually in the real sense. We got to see 4 different formats, and I think we all are better for it, and I think that'll make better debates in '96.
And I would agree with Frank that certainly neither the Clinton campaign nor the Bush campaign was negotiating against their perceived interests in the way the debates were going to be set up or who was going to be included. But nevertheless, whatever the motivations were, Ross Perot was involved in the debates, and I think it was a matter, and I recall specifically, it was a matter that the Commission had a lot of difficulty with at the point when we submitted the agreement to them. They met for hours, as I recall, to discuss the inclusion of Mr. Perot, or whether they would be willing to sponsor the debates with Mr. Perot because of some legal concerns that they had.
He was not included. The first vote was no, because at the time, prior to the first scheduled debate, Mr. Perot was not a declared candidate. That was the debate that we had to cancel, the first of the debates we had to cancel. So at that point in time, when we looked at it, he wasn't a declared candidate. So he was turned down, and I don't want to get ahead of the next panel, but the next panel, I think, can tell you the process by which the Commission used and our independent committee on inclusion. I'm sure Paul will have more to say about that.
Actually, it is now time for the next panel, so thank you. Unless, did you want to address that? Sure.
On that one question, again, there is no provision in the law today which requires a third-party candidate participation, because there is no mechanism for funding of third-party candidates. However, if there had been no debate at all, then there would have been no real mechanism for the American public to have a way of comparing that third-party candidate against the two major party candidates. So just by forcing a dynamic of the two major party candidates debating, it gives a third-party candidate, whether it be John Anderson, Ross Perot, or some unknown person in 1996, a vehicle that they can use to insert themselves into an ongoing national public debate. And again, there is no mandatory provision that forces anyone to debate. They don't have to. If they don't want to, they just don't qualify for the federal matching funds. But when $110 million of American taxpayer money is on the table, it seems to me it's a very minimum requirement, but the constitutional First Amendment provisions of each candidate is still intact as long as they don't want to take the money.
Thank you, Congressman Markey, and thank you to each of our panelists.
Good.
I hate to miss even a minute because we're right on the subject of this panel, and I don't want to lose the momentum here. So if everyone can be seated as quickly as possible, we'll continue this discussion. I'm Ellen Hume from the Joan Shorenstein Barone Center, and we're delighted to be working today with the Annenberg program. As it's already been said that the 1992 presidential debates drew one of the largest television audiences in world history. And so the stakes for the candidates and the political parties are commensurately high. And in a simpler era, when the two parties were the gatekeepers, deciding which non-aligned candidates might debate wasn't an issue. But as we've seen today, this is perhaps the most serious, hottest, unresolved area of the whole presidential debates process. How do we determine who gets included in the debates and when? And we have to help us with this discussion today John Anderson, the former U.S. Representative to Congress for the 16th District of Illinois, where he served 10 consecutive terms. And in 1980, he ran as an independent candidate for the presidency of the U.S. And he was in one debate with Ronald Reagan, and Jimmy Carter refused to participate. And then when they got down to the wire and it looked as if there were not going to be a Reagan-Carter debate at all, suddenly John Anderson was found not to be fit anymore. The threshold he could not meet was a 15% rating in the polls. We come then to 1992, where the Perot threshold was 7% and dropping. So we have a very interesting set of issues to talk about there. Michael Beschloss is a senior fellow of the Annenberg Washington Program and director of the program's Project on Television and U.S. Foreign Policy. He's just completed writing with Strobe Talbot a book at the highest level, The Inside Story of the End of the Cold War. It was not about the presidential debates. You've seen him on CNN quite a lot. Paul Kirk is counsel to Sullivan & Worcester and chairman of Kirk Shepard & Company, a business advisory firm specializing in U.S. and international market entry. And you probably know him better as the former chairman of the Democratic National Party and co-chairman of the Commission on Presidential Debates. And also with us today is Clay Mulford, otherwise known as Ross Clayton Mulford, who's a partner in the corporate and securities law section of the Texas-based law firm Hughes & Luce. And from March until November 1992, he served as chief counsel to the Perot campaign. In that capacity, he was responsible for ballot access in 50 states, federal election law compliance, and negotiating positions in the debates. So let's just revisit for a moment what we have now as current practice in establishing how someone gets to be part of the debate if that person is not the designated nominee of the Democratic or the Republican Party. The bipartisan commission turns to an advisory committee, currently chaired, I believe, by Professor Richard Neustadt of Harvard. And this advisory committee bases its decision of inclusion on a series of things. One, evidence of national organization. Typically, how many states are you on the ballot? Secondly, signs of national newsworthiness and competitiveness. Now we're getting a little more controversial. They turn to the Washington bureau chiefs of the major news organizations to determine whether this person is newsworthy. And of course, indicators of national enthusiasm or concern, i.e. the polls. Now critics say this places far too much power for determining who's in and who's out in the hands of the entrenched establishment, the two parties in the commission, the national news media, and the pollsters. Yet clearly some standards must be applied or we will lose what has become a watershed event in many presidential elections. I think the major question before us is how can we establish fair standards as we go forward? Some are actually saying in retrospect that it probably wasn't correct to include Ross Perot because he did not meet a pivotal criterion. There was no credible scenario under which he could have won the election, according to some of these critics. He was on the ballot in 50 states, but so was Andre Marou, the Libertarian candidate. Mr. Perot had 7% in the polls and was sinking when the commission invited him to participate. As I pointed out before, in 1980, John Anderson, also on the ballot in 50 states, had to meet a threshold of 15%. So, some also feel that, like the debates themselves, the idea that the candidates, and this was promoted, I think, very clearly in the last panel, that the candidates should be the ones to decide who gets to join them at the table. Now, is that fair? That seems to be a remarkable situation. If I wanted to run for president and the two guys who already had won the nominations of the two parties didn't think it was a good idea to have me sharing the nation's votes, they might not include me in the table. Well, if that's really where we stand, if that's really the standard that's in place, then I think we do need to come up with some new ideas today. So, questions on the table. Should the candidates determine who is included, which seems to be the practice at the moment? What is a fair standard? Did we have it in '92? And what should we do in the future about independent candidates for president who wish to join the debates? I'd like to start with our historian, Michael Beschloss.
Thanks, Ellen. Ellen didn't say it, but I am assuming that she is going to physically eject from this room anyone who begins his presentation by saying, "Who am I? Why am I here?" If you look at the history of third-party candidates and their relationship to presidential debates over the last 32 years, you find that the record has been very mercurial, and it's been a series of instances in which the limbo bar seems to be moving up and down, and third-party candidates have to deal with a very changeable situation. In 1960, the first year in which there was a televised debate between presidential candidates Kennedy and Nixon, Congress simply suspended Section 315A of the Federal Communications Act, in order to exclude third-party candidates from the debate. Oddly enough, although there were a number of third-party candidates running that year, none submitted a legal challenge, and it did not become an issue. In 1970, the Congress permanently passed a bill permanently repealing 315A. It went to the president for signature. The president was Richard Nixon, who not only did not have particularly agreeable views about third-party candidates in debates, but did not have a very agreeable attitude toward a presidential debate in 1972. In any case, he vetoed the bill, and the debate for 1972 was killed. Modern policy on third-party candidates in debates was really begun to be set by the League of Women Voters in 1976. They decided to limit the debate to Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford, major party contenders. For the first time, there was a serious legal challenge which came from Eugene McCarthy, who was running as a third-party candidate, running actually quite well in a number of states. He sought an injunction in the District of Columbia. That was refused by the U.S. Court of Appeals. He was kept out. 4 years later, the year in which John Anderson was a large factor, the League, which was sponsoring these debates, once again decided that a 15% tripwire should be the one that would keep third-party candidates out or in. And along with this, they had a number of requirements having to do with legal eligibility as well as ballot eligibility. It turned out to be a somewhat subjunctive process, as John Anderson found out. As was mentioned, there was a first debate between John Anderson and Ronald Reagan, and then he was excluded from the second debate. Once again, policy was very mercurial. I would like to argue that much of the policy toward third parties in debates over the last 32 years has been predicated to some extent that the two-party system is a mandate of heaven in this country, which it certainly is not. The two parties, and in fact political parties in general, are not mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. During the 19th century, there was a great effort by parties to restrict ballot laws and do a lot of other things that tended to enforce their monopoly. For much of the 19th century, the people who prepared and distributed ballots were not states or state governments, but actually political parties. The purpose, stated or unstated at the time, was to minimize confusion and enforce stability in the United States, but the effect was to depress the chances of third-party candidates throughout the 19th century and through much of the 20th. There was one study, for instance, in 1980 of the Reagan-Carter-Anderson race, which found that Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter got 10 times the coverage, not of John Anderson, but of John Anderson and all other third-party candidates who were running that year. That's very much a symptom of that. The reason why this seems a little bit odd is that when you look through the history, particularly the last 150 years, third parties have been a very crucial factor in a very large number of times. Since 1840, because of third-party candidates in the race, 40% of all those presidents who have been elected lacked a popular vote majority, which affected their presidencies. In the 1850s, the Republicans, needless to say, got 1/3 of the popular vote, 11 states, and 4 years later elected Abraham Lincoln. The Populists in 1892 got 22 electoral votes from the Great Plains and Western states. When Theodore Roosevelt ran in 1912 as a bull moose candidate, he got 88 electoral votes, and it changed the outcome of the election. And then, of course, in 1968, you had George Wallace running, who I think would have been judged a candidate who had a large chance of winning. He got 46 electoral votes, the largest popular vote ever by a third-party candidate. If you keep third-party candidates out of debates, you are, in a way, depressing and, in certain cases, removing the contribution that third parties have made throughout history. They tend to check the effectiveness of main parties. They tend also to bring issues onto the national agenda that sometimes are avoided by the two-party candidates. So just in providing context, if I might make a little bit of an editorial opinion, suggest one, strengthening the two-party system, as we hear it so many times, it's an admirable goal, but you look at so many other aspects of the process, most of these things tend to do that to the exclusion of third-party candidates. And also I would suggest that that is not the job of public policy or of the four major networks. I think I would finally say that competition is healthy in all things, and I think to a great extent, if you encourage third-party candidate involvement in presidential debates, it has the effect ultimately not of weakening the two-party system, but of strengthening it. So if I might close with one suggestion, which is not historical but editorial, it would be that I would urge that when the Commission is thinking about standards in the future for including third-party candidates, they err on the side of making it easy rather than making it difficult.
Thank you. I'd like to turn next to Clay Mulford. Clay, you told me before this panel that Mr. Perot's plan to buy $8 million worth of television time seemed to have influenced the Commission's decision-making, or making him seem more viable, and that this criterion, in your view, did not establish a good precedent. What do you think really enabled Perot to be included this time, and where do you think we should go next time in deciding these thresholds?
Let me give a little bit of background and by way of answering your first question. When Mr. Perot entered the race on October 1, he stood at, in most polls, approximately 7% and was heading down. I was very concerned about our ability to get into the debates based on the indications that would, or the indicia that would normally be used to see if someone was a serious presidential candidate under the criteria that the Commission was using. Mr. Perot was not out campaigning. He was not a visible candidate. His support was ebbing, and one of the inquiries that the Commission made to us when we sought contact with them was the amount of money that would be spent on advertising and the commitment to a TV budget. I had already, beginning on the 1st, made contact with each of the networks in order to start buying time in what was then very unusual slots and half-an-hour periods, etc., so that we could make that presentation to the Commission that we did have a substantial commitment to run a serious campaign. However, we did not feel that that was an appropriate criteria for the Commission to use. The mere access or ability to finance a campaign should not be the requirement for inclusion in the debates. That's not to say that the issue facing the Commission is not a difficult one, but I guess you judge the issue where you stand on the issue depends on where you sit, and where we sat was wanting to get Mr. Perot into the campaign, so we were glad that they were using that as an indication. I disagree, though, with the general statement that you may be indicating that Perot perhaps should not have been included based on his poll standing at that point. What is, of course, different in this situation, in Mr. Perot's situation, was that in June, without having spent more than $2.5 million, he was standing at number 1 in the polls. And in the California exit polls from the Republican and Democratic primaries, there was an indication that he could have won both of those primaries. So it's not a situation where you have a third-party candidate or an independent candidate arriving on the scene, standing at 5% in the polls with the ability to buy a tremendous amount of television time because he's personally wealthy. You have a situation where there was widespread public support, and he'd been back in the race for only 5 days. It was unpredictable whether that support would return. So I think that's a very significant difference. To return to the more general issue of the inclusion of third-party candidates and the Congressman Markey's bill, the tone seems to be, how do we make sure people get into debates? And our concern, of course, is how do you try to keep people out of the debates? We think the error should be made to include individuals, obviously, in the debates, and the bipartisan nature of the Commission we think should be changed to a nonpartisan or independent nature of a Commission, although we were quite happy with the both commissioners were very cooperative with us. Also, to follow up on the comments of the Clinton Gore and Bush Quayle representatives, it is true that they negotiated to have us involved in the debate. However, we were not allowed to participate in any interpretation or analysis of the agreement. The agreement was given to us on a take-it-or-leave-it basis, and in fact was given to us during a period over the weekend. We rejoined the race October 1, which was a Thursday. The commission was meeting that Friday and Saturday. Janet Brown is here. We made repeated phone calls, which she probably intelligently stopped taking from us as they were meeting to decide whether we should be in. We then turned our attention to the two campaigns, and in a series of discussions I had with Bobby Birchfield and Tom Donilon, who was the counsel to the Clinton campaign, received by Monday morning a fax draft of the agreement. And in the agreement, it specified that both we and the commission would be invited on a take-it-or-leave-it basis as long as we responded by the 6th or 7th. I've forgotten the date. So I issued a press release and filed a letter accepting the invitation and inquiring as to whether or not the commission had also accepted, suggesting that we would find another sponsor if need be. Is that although it was, I think, worked out, it was absolutely appropriate for us to be in the debates. I think that partially the popularity of the debates was in no small part due to Mr. Perot's presence in them. The criteria, though, of allowing the candidates to set the standard is not, in my mind, the solution. I think that the candidates perhaps can appoint a representative to the commission and then have the candidates, including the small and fringe party candidates, participate with the commission in making the decision on who should be included.
Okay, thank you. John Anderson, is that a fair standard?
Well, let me first say that had I followed Michael Beschloss a few minutes ago, I think that I would have intoned what my minister does on Sunday morning, amen, amen, and amen, because I firmly believe that third parties and independent candidates have a contribution, and a significant contribution to make to the political process. I firmly believe that Ross Perot went from 7% to 19% in the polls between Labor Day and the 3rd of November because of his participation in the debates. It was not his huge fortune. It was not his Texas Cracker Barrel humor. It was the fact that in the eyes of the American electorate, he was given a legitimacy when he appeared and they conferred on him equal stature with the candidates of the two major parties. So that leads me to the first point, and that is that I do not believe that the criteria for inclusion of third party or independent candidates should be left to the two parties. And I don't say this in criticism of the commission, because I think that they have performed a valuable service on which we can build. I've suggested that we ought to have an analog to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. We ought to have a corporation for presidential debates that would be organized and structured in a way that would involve a distinguished board of citizens across the country, people who hopefully in Hamilton or Madison's term would be beyond ambition, beyond political ambition, who could establish the kind of definite criteria that would not leave to chance the participation of an independent or third-party candidate in these all-important debates. We have heard several times this morning that we have now witnessed presidential debates in the last 5 presidential elections. However, there was that 12-year hiatus between my participation in 1980 and the participation of Ross Perot in 1992. That means I believe that in the future it is less than certain that some other independent or third-party candidate will be admitted to the debates. The Republicans this week are saying that the only things that are certain are death and taxes, and in that sense, I suppose they're right. And I believe that it is not certain that unless we develop a formula whereby third-party candidates and independent candidates have a right to participate, It simply will not occur. Now about criteria, before my time is up. I think it would be legitimate to suggest that a candidate should be on the ballot in enough states so that when you total the electoral votes of those states, he would have a theoretical majority in the Electoral College. I think that ought to be a benchmark. Ballot access laws are still tough. We fought in 10 states and all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1980 for the right to be on 50 state ballots. Gene McCarthy, to his credit, started that battle in 1976 in his independent campaign. So today it is much easier than before because of those past efforts for independent candidates to get on the ballot. I never sent Ross Perot a bill for the legal services that I had incurred in 1980, but I was tempted to a time or two. But in addition to ballot access, it seems to me that we shouldn't leave it to the news bureau chiefs. We shouldn't leave it to the representatives of the two parties. We should leave it to this board of a public corporation to decide on the other reasonable criteria that I think could be developed. Now, clearly, not everyone who calls himself an independent candidate for president or a third-party candidate should be admitted. I looked once in a previous election, I think it was 4 years ago, and 275 people had registered with the Federal Election Commission their intention to be a candidate for the presidency of the United States. We can't have 275 people crowding the debate platform. And yet the format of the debates in 1980 or in 1992 made it clear that there's nothing disruptive about exposing the television audience to the format of a three-person debate. I don't think it would have been fatal if you had had 4 people on the platform. So I would suggest that perhaps as a guideline or as a starter to initiate the kind of thinking that the commission that I am recommending should entertain, that between a 5 and 10% showing in national polls on Labor Day, when the campaign really begins, if a candidate, if a man or woman running for president has between 5 and 10% support in national polls, accredited polls, it seems to me that would be an important criteria. There might also be consideration given to whether or not they had at least a modicum of political organization in various states around the country that again would add up to a majority in the Electoral College. There might also be consideration given to their having a threshold of financial support, because I learned and already knew when I started my independent campaign that the financing for independent candidates is retroactive. Unless you reach the benchmark or threshold of 5% of the vote, you simply don't get any federal funding. So there might be some consideration given to whether or not the candidate has been successful in raising enough money. Maybe it would be the current standards for public financing of the primary phase of the presidential campaign, which is to raise at least $5,000 in 20 different states in contributions of $250 or more. Finally, I like Congressman Markey's bill, Senator Graham's bill. I would just hope that, Ed, you would consider amending it so that you would make more likely and more possible the inclusion of third-party or independent candidates. But I think it's you're right on when you say that when you spend over $100 million in public funds, that the taxpayers of this country, the contributors to the federal or presidential checkoff fund, have a right to expect that candidates will be willing to engage in public debate.
Thank you. We turn now to Paul Kirk. There are a bunch of proposals on the table, and the question still remains. It seems as if the candidates now, not the commission, but the candidates are the ones who decide whether or not the third-party person gets included. Is there a way to get around that, or is that fair? Is that inevitable politically?
I'd just like to, before I address that question, I just want to start with a historical footnote, that this conference takes place on the 6th birthday of the Commission on Presidential Debates. It was just 6 years ago today that Frank and I filed the Articles of Incorporation for the Commission. You folks, many of you, I know the institutions you represent and the individuals here were really a driving force in making that come about. I also would say in the last 6 years, as we debate, and we're all here to try to improve what has happened, do not lose sight of what has happened. This is not an easy process. It involves legal ramifications, political, technical, logistics, and this year in 1992, with the help and input of the candidates and the ideas of others, for the first time in history, we had debates, 3 presidential and 1 vice presidential, that involved 3 different candidates and representatives. The largest viewer turnout in history. First time ever single moderators were involved, and the first time ever you had a variation of formats. So I think a lot has happened. I would say this, with respect to the institutionalization of debates, I want to say this clearly, I believe it's here, particularly in view of what Marvin spoke to. We are in a new electronic age. There's going to be a lot of television, and I think voters believe that the choice in those final innings between who will be the next president of the United States is going to be there for the years to come. I also believe, parenthetically, that whether we like it or not, negotiation between the candidates with respect to debates has been institutionalized as well. I don't think that can be legislated out, and I think given the changes and some of the things that came to the table and helped us this year, it's not a bad thing. Finally, on that point, with regard to posturing, this is a democracy. Diane Carlin, who will be on one of the panels, will tell you that the focus groups learned a lot from the posturing between the candidates before those debates took place and made some judgments about it. So it's not all bad. That's what I say. Now, on to the criterion. Let me say we have to separate 2 things. I've heard 2 different versions. We cannot have it both ways this morning. We cannot have it said that the Commission on Presidential Debates are the gatekeepers, making decisions about whether candidates are in and out, and on the other hand, the candidates are the ones who are making the choice. In my view, neither is the case. I don't think there's anyone who would argue that Richard Neustadt, Dot Ridings, the former president of the League of Women Voters, Eddie Williams of the Joint Center of Political Studies, Ken Miller from the University of Virginia, or Diane Carlin can be called gatekeepers. Well, who are they? They're an independent, arm's-length advisory committee put together to decide what should be the criteria. Same thing we're talking about today. I don't think anyone is final and certain that all criteria that were happened in '92 should be those criteria forever and a day. The reason we have this conference, and we'll have our own in May, is to try to continue to refine and build and make a better mousetrap, if you will. But the point is, though they drew up criteria in 1988, I must add that a lot of that is now in litigation, and it's already gone up to the Supreme Court. It will continue. I would want to come back to 1992 and the Ross Perot situation and the importance of criteria, and I think multiple criteria. In 1980, John Anderson was in the first debate against Ronald Reagan. The second debate, they took a look at the polls, decided he was out. It was an absolute number, and that was the end of it. Had that criteria been applied and used by the Commission this year, Ross Perot would not have been in the debates. Now, people can argue, should Ross Perot have been in the debates or not? We had certain criteria. They're in their packets. It involves a number of things, constitutional, as well as what we consider real political equations. When you have an individual, and I wasn't in the room when this committee met, but I can imagine people saying, Ross Perot has more money than Bill Clinton and George Bush combined. He was leading them both in the polls in his first incarnation. He comes back and he says he's going to spend $5 million at 2 half hours before the debates. He's at 7% in the polls. There is no doubt a Perot phenomenon out there. And what does the Commission say? It says to both campaigns, the Bush campaign, the Clinton campaign, listen, we have a commission. They drew up these criteria judicially. It is our belief they will be applied fairly. And you better be prepared to live with them, because we're going to live with them. If they say Perot in, Perot in. If they say Perot out, Perot out. And if you don't like it, either campaign, you'll have to find another sponsor. Now, I know in the the Clinton campaign with whom I dealt, the response was, that's the commission's business and we'll live with it. I believe the political reality is that given the phenomenon of the Perot campaign in particular, and the kind of groundswell he had, and the media fascination, quite frankly, that there was with Ross Perot, that the candidates felt it in their interest preempt the commission. What if they say no to Perot? What if they make a judgment that he doesn't meet the criteria? Not going to be on my back. There's a whole number of people out there that are fed up with government. There's gridlock. So you had all this dynamic working. In the meantime, we get a late entry by Ross Perot. The candidates did extend an invitation, which I believe they did in their best interest, and good luck to them. But we still had a responsibility, that committee did, to go back into the room and say, what's going on here? What are our criteria? What's fair? And they made a judgment. And they made a recommendation to the commission, and we accepted it. I believe, in my own view, it was judicially applied and fairly drawn, and the results were, John made a point about, had it not been for the debate, that might have been a different result, but the numbers, wherever they are that Bill Clinton gets 43%, George Bush gets 37%, Ross Perot gets 19%, and then all of a sudden it drops off to Mr. Moreau, who gets 0.09, Bo Gritz gets 0.07, and Ms. Filani gets 0.04 or whatever it was. And the truth of it is, did it make a difference? Should he have been in the debate? Is it still a fact? As we speak, Ross Perot is flying cover for Bill Clinton and the Democratic Congress and others who think this deficit ought to be settled. It's a big issue out there. And when you look back in hindsight, you say, well, did they do the right thing or not do the right thing? The fact is, there was a third-party candidate there. I think, for my own, speaking for myself, that there ought to be criteria that institutionalize an opportunity for independent or third-party candidates to be invited. However, let me just say this about the mission of the Commission on Presidential Debates as I see it today. It is not to provide a springboard for candidates not yet known to find a place to leap in at the last month or whatever it might be into the national spotlight. Rather, it is to apply criteria which people can say, this is my time to make a choice about who will be the next president of the United States. And Dick Neustadt started off saying it should be realistic, it should be more than theoretical, and there's a whole host of criteria which we can examine and will examine and so forth. My point is that we are not, at least at this moment, the Commission on Debates. We're the Commission on Presidential Debates. And John is right, maybe 4 is okay, but the question is, where do you draw the line and how do you draw the line? One other point I would make with respect to the composition of the commission and who should be on it. It really makes no difference, I don't believe, although we make a very convenient whipping boy. It's not who serves, it's how they serve and how they conduct their business. And I happen to believe that we did a credible job, and for those of us who may or may not continue to serve, if it's still some expansion of the commission, this is a national public interest. And voter participation this year went up. I like to believe, in addition to the contributions of Ross Perot, that it had to do with the debates. And people saying, listen, we've seen all the spots, we've seen all the ads, we've heard the stump speeches. Let's compare these guys. And that's why I think debates are institutionalized. And the other kinds of things, how they should be supported and framed, are very important issues. We're delighted to be part of this panel today. We hope some of you will be part of ours in May and be delighted to respond to whatever questions.
Thank you. We have 10 minutes for very compact, 8 to 10 minutes for some inclusion from the group here. Who would like to speak on the issue? Yes.
Mr. Anderson, I'd just like to ask if, under some sets of criteria, Filani and Moreau could have been in the debates, making it a 5-person debate, and I think giving rise to speculation that it might be a 3-ring circus. As you well know, in 1980, Carter's campaign didn't want you in there because they thought there would be 2 of you beating up on him. If you have 5 candidates in a debate, if the candidates have a role in it, the incumbent president and his handlers are not going to want to be in that debate with 4 people going after them. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, they will be if we pass Congressman Markey and Senator Graham's bill. If they want public funding, they're going to have to agree, even though there is more or are more than 2 or 3 people on the platform. However, I think the figures were just given by Paul Kirk a moment ago about what Mr. Moreau and what Ms. Fulani got. And when you get down to less than 1% of the vote, and that's reflected in presumably in polling data that could be accumulated before the decision is made as to who will participate, I think then you can fairly exclude people. Or you might, if you structure this along the lines that I was suggesting, you might even have a second tier of candidates. I can remember Democratic primaries where they had a thundering herd of more than a half a dozen candidates, and we talked about the first tier and the second tier. Maybe you could have a second tier of these candidates who could participate in debates, but I think it would be fair to exclude them below a certain threshold of public support.
Yes.
Bill Rosenberg, and I don't know exactly who would be the responder to the question, but the concern I have is the issue about poll results, and in particular, would the question in the poll be, do you want to hear this person's point of view, or are you planning to vote for this person? Because I think there are 2 different issues. I think many wanted to hear Ross Perot, but not necessarily were going to vote for Ross Perot. And I think the question of excluding him would have been one of access in terms of thought, even more than the probability of not being able to vote for him. So I don't know if you would like to pick that question up.
Well, I just say on the polls themselves, I think even pollsters would say if it's just the polling results at a moment in time or just eligibility for federal funding, that either of those or both of those may not be enough. I know that Peter Hart has written about it, and used the League of Women Voters example in 1980 when John was involved. As this was polls and public opinions change quickly. That's why I would argue with respect to polls that it ought to be one of several criteria that are involved that meet the dynamics of the particular time. The other question that comes up, I mean, that's why, again, I'd go to multiple criteria. There are a lot of people who perhaps wanted to see Ross Perot just because of the entertainment value. There are also, as you know, many single-issue candidates who have a following. I'm not sure where they'd end up in terms of the polling, but if that's the reason to bring someone into a debate, I would argue, at least from my point of view, that is not the purpose of what the debates are about. It's to allow the American people to select the next president. And therefore, as I say, and it said in my remarks, I think the evolution of criteria that meet that objective is really where we should be headed.
Can I follow up on that? Just so that my remarks aren't misinterpreted, from our experience, we would like the power of the commission enhanced, not diminished, but to have that power enhanced in a nonpartisan rather than bipartisan way, although I'm absolutely in agreement that the manner in which it was handled in our case by the commission was to be commended. If the parties have all the power in the relationship, they have a vested interest in preventing the rise of third-party initiatives, which we think is negative. And although we absolutely, it would have been very, very difficult for us to achieve ballot access in the disorganized grassroots nature of the movement from February through July without John Anderson having gone before us. And we did use to our great benefit the cases that were produced by that in a situation where we were nervous that the Supreme Court might come down in a different way because of the composition of the Supreme Court today. It is not easy to get on the ballot in 50 states. It is difficult. To say that it is Byzantine is too generous because that implies there's some kind of order or logic to the rules in the states. It is ripe for abuse, and if people wanted to prevent you from getting on the ballot, there are innumerable ways to launch court challenges to make it either financially impossible for someone to get on the ballot in all 50 states or practically impossible because of the mechanisms that are available for abuse. So a 50-state requirement for ballot access is probably unwise in our view, and I know that the Republican Party and perhaps the Democratic Party, but we know that the Republican Party assembled filings to consider challenging our status and ability in a number of states in the summer period where Mr. Pro had withdrawn as a candidate. So I make those two remarks, and I want to also underline John Anderson's statement. The current method by which third-party candidates receive federal funding in the federal election is post hoc. You get a proportion based on a portion of what the major party candidates receive based on your proportion of the vote. That makes it very difficult because you, in essence, are front-end financing a third-party movement, and we think that that should be changed as well.
Just one very quick comment. If you broaden the format and the structure of the present bipartisan commission and organize this public corporation for presidential debate, that single issue candidate who may have a fairly high standing in the polls, but only because his adherents believe in his position on one issue alone. And my point is that the commission could then schedule other types of events where you would have a discussion among the candidates simply on that single issue and expose the varying points of view that they held. I think you have to broaden this really ultimately beyond simply the format of some presidential debates. You have to have other kinds of public discussion on rather specific issues.
Excuse me. I just want to add a point, too, from a historical perspective. I think the issue will become more and more at an issue then become less of one because of the technological changes, the ability of people to go directly to the voters on talk shows, as Perot did originally, but people that have access to media, a Rush Limbaugh, a Bill Cosby, you're going to see an increase in the number of people making direct communications to voters, not a decrease, not a diminution, and you may have a fracturing of the voting population into smaller support pockets for different people. So it's a very timely question, I think.
That, in fact, is a great segue to our coffee break and our next panel, which is about this. But as we bring this to a close, I think that it's very interesting to observe that there are some comments about changing perhaps the nature of the bipartisan commission and being sure that these independent, non-aligned candidates get more consistent treatment in the future. So go to coffee. We'll be back in, I guess it's 15 minutes.
Yeah, I thought you are today.
Sorry.
No, that's fine.
Terrific.
Washington, D.C. 20004.
I never would have I'm finishing a book called Narrating Presidency.
C-SPAN 2, like its companion network C-SPAN, is funded entirely